Malcolm Sutter didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open Elowen Hartley's front door like he already owned it, because in his mind, he already did, and stood in her doorway with the cold October wind at his back, looking around her kitchen with the slow, deliberate eyes of a man calculating what everything would fetch at auction. "I've been patient," he said, not bothering to introduce himself, not bothering to remove his hat. "Most women in your situation would have taken my offer 3 months ago." He dropped a folded paper on her table. "Sign it today. I'll have someone haul your things out by Thursday." Elowen was standing at her stove. She didn't turn around. "Get out of my house," she said. Sutter smiled. "It's not your house much longer, sweetheart." If you've never seen a woman hold herself that still while everything inside her is on fire, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, because the stories we tell here will surprise you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. 3 weeks before Malcolm Sutter walked through her door uninvited, Elowen Hartley had been awake for 31 hours straight. She hadn't planned it that way. She'd sat down beside the fireplace after supper to look over the ledger. The same brown leather ledger she'd kept since the first year of her marriage, filled with columns of numbers that told the honest, unsparing story of what this land had cost and what it had returned. She'd meant to rest her eyes for 20 minutes. She woke up to the sound of horses. The fire had gone out sometime in the night. The October cold had moved in through every crack in the walls, and her neck ached from the angle she'd fallen asleep at. And for one disoriented second, she didn't know what day it was, or why her ledger was open to the page where she'd recorded the sale of her last 4 cows. Then she heard the horses again, and she was fully awake. She was on her feet before she consciously decided to stand. Boots already on. She'd stopped taking them off at night 2 winters ago, when a fence line collapsed in a snowstorm at 2 in the morning and she'd had to run out into the dark in her stockings. She crossed to the window and looked out. One rider, coming up the long approach from the south road. Elowen's hand found the rifle above the door without her having to think about it. The rider was a man she didn't recognize, big-framed, wearing a good coat, riding a horse that was too clean and too well-fed to belong to anyone struggling. He wasn't moving fast. He was moving the way men move when they're looking at something, when they're taking inventory without appearing to. He stopped at the fence line. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the yard, looking at the house. Then he looked at the barn, which was listing slightly to the east and had been since the summer hailstorm that had taken half the roof. Then he looked at the garden, her garden, the rows she'd turned and planted in June when she had nothing else left to bet on. And something about his expression shifted in a way she couldn't read from the window. He dismounted. Elowen's grip on the rifle didn't change. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked through the gate, which she noticed he latched carefully behind him. That was the detail that made her watch differently. Men who meant immediate harm didn't latch gates. Men who were running a casual intimidation errand didn't stop to look at vegetable rows. She still didn't put the rifle down. He knocked. She opened the door with the rifle at her side, barreled toward the floor, not hidden and not raised, just present. He was older than she'd thought from the window. Not old, maybe 40, 45, but the kind of weather that came from actual outdoor work rather than from drinking. His eyes were gray, and they went straight to the rifle without flinching, which told her he'd been in situations before where someone pointed a gun at him and he'd survived them. "Gideon Rourke," he said. He didn't offer his hand, which she appreciated. A man who reads a situation doesn't reach for a handshake when the woman he's talking to is holding a firearm. "I run cattle operation east of here, out toward the Cimarron Fork." "I know who you are," Elowen said. She did. Everyone in the county knew who Gideon Rourke was. You couldn't spend 2 years trying to hold on to a piece of Kansas land without learning which names controlled the water, the roads, and the grazing routes. Rourke's name came up the way weather came up, as a fact of the landscape that you accounted for whether you wanted to or not. "Then you know I don't make a habit of walking onto people's land without reason," he said. "What's your reason?" He looked past her, briefly, at the dead fireplace, at the ledger still open on the chair, at the kitchen that was clean but stripped. No extra dishes, no decorative anything, nothing that hadn't earned its place. She watched him take it all in and file it away, and she didn't like it, but she didn't step back either. "I'm running a cattle route this fall along the South Creek," he said. "Your property sits right across the crossing I need. I wanted to talk about access." "You're trespassing," Elowen said. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked like a man who had just been given a piece of information he was going to hold on to. "I am," he agreed. I should have sent a rider first. You should have. He nodded. I'll go, but I'd like to come back and talk to you about the crossing, if you're willing. Elowen studied him for a long moment. The fire was out and the house was cold and her neck hurt, and she was looking at a man who could probably buy her entire property, every acre and every broken fence post, without feeling the expense. And he was standing on her porch asking permission to have a conversation. That was not how it usually went. Come back Thursday, she said. Knock first. Yes, ma'am. He walked back to his horse, unlatched the gate, went through, and latched it again behind him. Elowen stood in the doorway and watched him ride back down the south road until he was out of sight. Then she went inside, rebuilt the fire, and sat down with her ledger and tried to think clearly about what she had and what she was about to get into. The South Creek crossing. She knew exactly which crossing he meant. It was the only reliable ford for 6 miles in either direction during October when the water ran fast. A natural limestone shelf that sat just below the surface and let cattle cross without bogging down. Her husband Daniel had used it for years before his heart gave out in the middle of a cold snap 18 months ago, leaving her with the ranch, the debt, the drought, and the choice of whether to keep fighting or let the whole thing go. She had chosen to keep fighting. That choice had cost her the cattle, the horses except for 1, 2 of the 4 field sections, and everything that wasn't nailed down and necessary. She'd sold her mother's silver candlesticks in July. She didn't let herself think about that too long. The crossing, though, the crossing was hers, and Gideon Rourke needed it. That was the first time since Daniel died that Elowen felt something other than the particular exhausted grief of a person who is losing a slow war of attrition. What she felt, sitting by the fire with her ledger, was leverage. Thursday came with a hard frost and a sky the color of iron. Gideon Rourke arrived exactly when he said he would, which in her experience was unusual for wealthy men, who tended to operate on the assumption that their time was more valuable than anyone else's. He came with his foreman, a rangy, quiet man named Silas Boone, who had the watchful manner of someone who had survived a great deal by noticing things early. And he knocked, and he waited. Elowen had made coffee. Not because she felt hospitable, but because she intended this to be a business conversation, and business conversations happened at tables with something in your hands. She let them in, poured 2 cups without asking, and sat down across from Gideon at the table she'd had for 14 years. It was a good table. Solid oak, handmade, 1 leg repaired with a different wood that didn't match but held fine. She'd kept it specifically because it held fine. The crossing, she said. The crossing, he agreed. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at her directly. I need cattle access from the 2nd week of October through the first freeze. That's probably 6, 7 weeks. 3 crossings a week, maybe 4 during the main push. My herd runs about 800 head. Elowen had already done the math. 800 head of cattle crossing a limestone shelf repeatedly over 6 weeks did things to creek banks. It tore up vegetation, destabilized the soil, muddied the water table for the downstream sections she was trying to use for her spring planting. What are you offering? She said. Gideon glanced at Silas, not in a consulting way, more in the way of a man making sure he was being heard accurately. Then he looked back at her. Fence repair, he said. Your south and east lines are failing. My crew will rebuild them before winter. Full replacement on the posts, new wire. Elowen looked at her coffee. The fence. She'd been staring at that failing fence line since August, calculating whether she could repair it herself before the first serious snow, and understanding with a cold, specific clarity that she could not. Not alone, not without money she didn't have for materials. What else? She said. He paused. Barn roof. She looked up. The east slope is going, he said. He wasn't being kind about it. He was just saying what was true. Another winter without repair and you'll lose the structure. My carpenter can stabilize it before November. Elowen set her cup down. Her hands were steady, which took some doing because what he was describing, fence repair and barn stabilization, was the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it. And she knew it, and she suspected he knew it, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. You know what the creek access is worth, she said, to your operation. I do. Then you know what you're offering doesn't match it. Silas Boone made a small sound that might have been a cough or might have been something else. Gideon looked at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not irritation, not recalculation. Something that looked closer to interest. What would match it? He said. So Elowen told him. She'd spent the days between his first visit and Thursday morning writing it out in the ledger, the same way she wrote everything, clearly in columns with numbers attached to every item and conditions spelled out precisely. She slid the paper across the table. He read it without speaking. The terms were this: creek access as discussed, with a strict limitation on the number of crossings per week to protect the bank. His crew would repair the fence and barn. Any damage to the creek bank beyond natural wear would immediately void the agreement and require his operation to fund full restoration. She would have written approval rights over when and how the crossings occurred, and the arrangement would be documented as a lease agreement, not a favor, not a gift, not an act of charity. A legal transaction with her as the party who held the rights. Gideon read it twice. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Yes." "You have legal training?" "No." She paused. "I have a husband who died and left me to figure things out." Something moved across his face that she didn't fully read. He set the paper down. "I want Silas to look at the creek bank conditions before I agree to the restoration clause," he said, "to establish a baseline. That's fair to both of us." Elowen considered this. It was fair. He wasn't trying to escape the clause. He was trying to make it precise. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning," he agreed. They shook hands across the table with the mismatched leg, and Elowen thought that she had just made either the most useful deal of her life or the most dangerous one, and she wouldn't know which for a while yet. Silas Boone arrived the next morning with a younger ranch hand named Cord and spent 2 hours walking the creek bank with Elowen, taking measurements and making notes that Elowen simultaneously made in her own ledger. She had learned, from 14 years of running a ranch alongside Daniel, that 2 sets of records were always better than one. Cord was maybe 22, fresh-faced, and had apparently been told something about this widow and her property that had given him a certain attitude, a kind of careful, exaggerated politeness that men deploy when they expect someone to need managing. He found out quickly that Elowen did not need managing. When he started explaining to her how creek bank erosion worked, she interrupted him with a description of the water table behavior along this specific section of creek during the previous 3 October rainfall patterns, complete with the measurements she'd taken herself, recorded in the ledger she was holding. He stopped explaining things after that. Silas, who had been listening, looked at Elowen with the particular attention of a man revising an assumption. He didn't say anything then, but she noticed that for the rest of the morning, when there was a question about the terrain, he asked her before he consulted the measurements. The baseline documentation took the full 2 hours. When they were done, Elowen had a copy and Silas had a copy, and they both signed them. "You're thorough," Silas said as they walked back toward the house. "I have to be," she said. "There's no one else to be thorough for me." He nodded slowly, like that meant something he was going to think about later. The crew arrived the following Monday. Elowen had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Men who would work quickly and competently and then leave, probably. Men who would be polite but distant. Men who would treat her property like a job site and treat her like the incidental civilian living in the middle of it. What she got was a crew of 8 who arrived at dawn and set up in the yard with lumber and wire and post-hole equipment, and when she came out at 5:30 with coffee and found them already working, the foreman looked up and started to give her a rundown of the plan for the day. She said, "The northwest corner post needs to go 18 inches deeper than the others. The soil composition is different there. There's a clay shelf that shifts in the spring thaw." The foreman looked at her. "I know," she said. "It's not obvious unless you've watched it for a few years." He went and dug the northwest corner post 18 inches deeper. She picked up a fence post. "Ma'am, you don't have to." "I'm aware," she said, and started walking toward the line. By mid-morning, she was working alongside his crew, not directing them. They knew their trade, but contributing in the specific ways that came from knowing this exact ground. She showed them where the wire would catch on a buried rock formation unless they angled the run. She pointed out the gate section that needed to be rebuilt rather than repaired, because the frame had rotted at the base and new wire on a rotted frame was money wasted. She spotted a section of the east line that wasn't on the original repair list but was 6 weeks from failure, and she said so. The foreman, whose name turned out to be Wade, added it to the list without being asked twice. Gideon arrived in the early afternoon, unannounced but not unexpected. She'd half assumed he'd want to see the work in progress. He pulled up on his horse at the north fence and watched for a while before he dismounted. She was driving a post at the time. She heard his horse and kept driving the post. He walked along the fence line, talking with Wade for a few minutes, looking at the work. Then he walked over to where she was working. "Wade says you've saved him 2 redos already today," he said. "I know this fence line better than anyone who's never been here before," she said. It wasn't meant as a criticism, it was just true. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, He says you know it better than a few people who have been here before. Elowen straightened up and looked at him. Your husband? Gideon said, not prying, genuinely asking. Daniel was good with cattle, she said. He had less patience for the fixed infrastructure, fences, drainage, barn structure. He'd patch things when they needed patching. She paused. I mapped everything the first year we were here. I wanted to understand what we owned. And you've kept the maps. They're in the ledger. He looked at the ledger, which was sitting on a fence post 10 feet away, because she'd learned that the ledger went wherever she went when work was being done. And something in his expression shifted again, that same quality of revision she'd seen in Silas the morning before. I'd like to look at them, he said. The maps, when you're willing. I've been trying to understand the water table behavior in this section for 3 seasons. Elowen considered that. When the fence is done, she said, fair. He stayed another hour, walking the line, talking to Wade, not getting in the way. He said goodbye to her when he left, and she nodded, and he rode back down the south road the same direction he'd come from the first time. She watched him go, and then she picked up the next post. The fence crew finished in 5 days. The barn carpenter arrived on day 6 and spent 3 days on the east slope, and when he was done, the roof would last at least another decade if she kept the ice clear. It was on the second day of the barn work that she heard the name for the first time. She was in the yard when Wade's youngest hand, a boy named Pell, barely 18, who talked more than was probably good for him, said something to Cord about a man named Sutter who'd been asking around town about the Hartley property. Elowen stopped walking. What did you say? She said. Pell looked startled. Just, I heard in town, ma'am. Man named Sutter's been asking around about this place. About whether the deed's clear and whether the taxes are current. Elowen's hands went still. She knew what that meant. A man asking about deed clarity and tax status wasn't a buyer curious about a property. A man asking those specific questions was a man looking for a weakness in the paper, a gap where a legal challenge could find a foothold. When did you hear this? She said. 2-3 days ago. Pell said. She went inside and checked her deed. She checked it 3 times. It was clear. The taxes were current, barely, by amounts that had required her to sell things she didn't want to sell, but they were current. The deed was clean. But knowing her paperwork was solid didn't make her feel as steady as she'd expected, because men like Sutter, she'd heard the name before, though she hadn't known he was looking in her direction, didn't need your paperwork to be weak. They needed you to be scared enough to sign something while you were scared. They needed you to believe the fight was unwinnable before the fight actually started. She sat at the table with the ledger open and wrote down the name, Malcolm Sutter. Below it, she wrote, asking about deed status and tax records. Purpose unclear. Watch. Then she made herself eat supper, rebuild the fire, and go to sleep at a reasonable hour because a person who didn't sleep made mistakes, and she could not afford mistakes right now. He came 3 days later. She had not told Gideon. She had not sent word to anyone. She had spent 3 days working, keeping her eyes open, noting everything that moved on her property that shouldn't have, and waiting. Malcolm Sutter didn't knock. He pushed her door open at mid-morning while she was in the kitchen, and walked in like he'd done it before, and set himself in the middle of her space like a man establishing territory, and looked around with the specific contemptuous inventory of someone who has already decided this place belongs to him. He was in his 50s, heavy across the chest, with the kind of self-assured stillness that came from having bought his way out of every difficult situation he'd encountered for 20 years. He was dressed expensively. He had the hands of a man who wrote checks rather than pulled wire. He looked at her kitchen, and then he looked at her, and his expression said something that his mouth hadn't gotten to yet. This is already over for you. I've been patient, he said. Most women in your situation would have taken my offer 3 months ago. I haven't received an offer from you, Elowen said. You've received inquiries, Sutter said. He dropped the folded paper on her table. That's a fair price. More than fair, given current conditions. She didn't pick it up. She didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on him. I don't recall receiving any inquiries, she said. Through my agent, he said, with the impatience of a man who considers his agents an extension of himself. Hartley, let's not waste each other's time. You're holding 320 acres that you can't work. Your cattle are gone. You've got 1 horse. Your fence was failing until last week. He paused on that, looking at her with an expression that told her he'd noticed the new fence and he'd had to recalculate something about what he was walking into, and you're 1 bad winter away from losing the deed on back taxes. My taxes are current, she said. For now. She picked up the folded paper finally. She unfolded it and looked at the number and refolded it and set it back down. "Get out of my house," she said. Sutter's expression didn't change. "You're making an emotional decision." "I'm making a very clear-headed decision," she said. "You walked into my home without permission. You dropped a paper on my table and told me to sign it. That is not a negotiation. That is a threat delivered at close range." She looked at him steadily. "Leave." He didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment with that self-assured stillness, the kind of man who expected that the weight of him, the size of his offer and his reputation and his presence in her kitchen would eventually move her. It didn't. "Think carefully," he said. "I've bought land from people who thought they could hold out, and I've bought it from people who didn't think they could. The price I'm offering today is the highest you'll see from me." "Then I suppose we're done talking," Elowen said. She walked to the door and opened it. He left. I took his time about it, because men like Sutter always took their time leaving, always made sure their departure felt like a choice rather than a retreat. But he left. Elowen closed the door and stood with her back to it and breathed. Then she sat down at the table, opened the ledger, and wrote down every word she could remember of the conversation, in order, with the approximate time and the date at the top of the entry. She wrote, "He will come back." She underlined it. Then she wrote, "When he does, I will not be alone." She sat for a long time looking at that last line. Then she picked up her coat, went to the barn, saddled her one remaining horse, and rode east toward the Cimarron Fork to talk to Gideon Rourke. She hadn't planned to tell him. She had spent 3 years learning how to handle things alone because alone was what she had. Asking for help felt like something she'd put away in a drawer she didn't open anymore. But there was a difference, she told herself as she rode, between asking for help and informing a business partner of a development that affected both of their interests. Sutter wasn't just coming for her land. He was coming for the creek crossing. He was coming for the water rights and the grazing routes and everything downstream of Elowen's 320 acres that Gideon Rourke's operation depended on. This was relevant information. That's what she told herself. She rode east, and the cold October sky pressed down flat and wide overhead, and somewhere behind her, Malcolm Sutter was riding back toward town, already planning what came next. Gideon Rourke's ranch house was bigger than she'd expected, which was not a compliment in her mind. Big houses on working ranches tended to mean someone was spending money on the wrong things. But when she rode up to it in the late afternoon, she noticed that the house itself was plain, functional, built for weather rather than for impressing people. The size was just size. The land around it was immaculate in the way that working land gets immaculate, not through decoration, but through constant attention. A hand she didn't know took her horse at the gate. Silas Boone met her on the porch before she'd crossed the yard, which told her either he'd seen her coming from a distance or someone had, and that Gideon Rourke's operation ran with enough discipline that visitors were tracked. She filed that away without deciding what to think about it yet. "Mrs. Hartley," Silas said. "Is he here?" "He is. Come in." Gideon was at a work table in the front room, which had the feel of a room that had been a parlor once and had gradually surrendered to paperwork. Maps were pinned to one wall. There were ledgers. His own, several of them, thick and worn at the spines, stacked on a shelf beside the window. He looked up when she came in, and his expression went through 2 or 3 things quickly before it settled into something neutral and watchful. "You rode out here yourself," he said. "I did." "Sit down." She didn't want to sit down. But she sat down because this was his house, and she was the one who'd come asking. And she had enough self-awareness to know that arriving somewhere agitated and then refusing to sit was not a good way to open a conversation you needed to go well. She told him about Sutter. She told him straight through, start to finish, in the order it happened, the way she'd learned to tell things, without editorializing, without softening, just the sequence of facts and the words she remembered as close to exact as she could get them. She told him about Pell overhearing the conversation in town. She told him about the door opening without a knock. She told him about the paper on the table and the price she hadn't looked at twice, and the things Sutter had said about her tax situation. When she finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did he leave your property?" he said. 4 hours, maybe a little more. He looked at Silas, who was standing in the doorway. Something passed between them that Elowen didn't have the context to read. "Sutter," Silas said, flatly. Not a question. Like the name answered something that had been open. "You know him," Elowen said. "We know of him," Gideon said. "He bought the Alderman parcel 2 years ago. Before that, the Kemper homestead north of Dodge. Both times the owners sold under circumstances that weren't entirely voluntary." "What circumstances?" Gideon looked at her directly. The Kemper family had a fence fire. Could have been lightning. Wasn't lightning season. Elowen sat with that for a moment. He told me the price today was the highest I'd see from him, she said. It probably is, Gideon said. That's how he works. He comes in polite first, then the problems start, and by the time you're dealing with the problems, you're too tired to fight, and his offer looks different than it did. I wrote down everything he said, Elowen said. Verbatim, as close as I could manage, times, date, exact words. Silas looked at her again with that revising expression. That's smart, Gideon said. That's very smart. Do you have it with you? She pulled the ledger from her coat. She'd brought it, though she hadn't consciously decided to. The ledger came with her the way her boots came with her, a thing that just happened, because leaving without it felt wrong. She opened it to the entry and pushed it across the work table. Gideon read it. He read it slowly, which she appreciated. Men who skimmed documents and then told you what they meant irritated her. He read to the end, and then he read part of it again, and then he looked up. He mentioned the taxes specifically, he said. Yes. He's planning a pressure campaign, the fence fire approach or something like it, something that costs you money and time right when you can least afford either. He'll wait until you're running out of room and come back with a lower number. I know, Elowen said. That's why I'm here. Gideon was quiet again. Outside, a wind had picked up, and somewhere in the yard, a gate was banging with it. Neither of them moved to address the noise. What do you need from me? He said. Elowen had thought about this on the ride over. She'd had time to think, and she'd made herself think carefully rather than just react, because reacting was how you ended up in agreements you regretted. I don't need money, she said. I'm not asking you to buy him off or threaten him or do anything that puts your operation in the middle of my problem. The creek crossing agreement is what it is, and I don't want to muddy that. All right. What I need is for people in this county to know that my land isn't sitting unprotected. Sutter's strategy depends on me being isolated. He looks at that property and he sees a widow with no cattle and no money and no one who'd make noise if she sold or was pushed out. She paused. I need that calculation to be wrong. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. Ride into town tomorrow morning, he said to Silas. Stop at the feed store and the post office. You know what to mention and what not to. Silas nodded once and left the doorway. Gideon looked back at Elowen. I'll have Wade and 2 of his crew do a second fence check on your south line next week. They'll come in from the roadside, visible from the main approach. That's a performance, she said. Yes. I'm not complaining, she said. I'm just noting that you understand what it is. Presence is information, he said. You already know that. You've been managing what information this county has about your situation for 2 years. She hadn't thought of it in those terms, but he wasn't wrong. Every choice she'd made about what to let people see and what to keep private had been, in its own way, a message. The swept yard, the planted garden, boots on, ledger open, rifle by the door. All of it was information she was sending, whether she'd framed it that way or not. There's something else, she said. Tell me. He mentioned the deed. He was asking around about deed clarity. My deed is clean, but I want to understand why he'd ask that question. Is there something about the original survey of this section that I should know about? Gideon was very still for a moment. What section are you on? 22. Southwest quarter plus the east 40 added in the original purchase. 320 total. He stood up and went to the map wall. He stood in front of it with his hands at his sides, looking at it, and she couldn't see his face. Gideon, she said. He turned around. His expression had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not concern exactly, but a particular kind of alertness that made her sit up straighter. Section 22 had a disputed corner survey in 1871, he said. There was a resurvey done in 74 that was supposed to settle it. Most people think it did settle it, but the original county record has a notation on it, a clerical hold that was never formally cleared. He paused. It wouldn't invalidate your deed, but it's the kind of thing a man with a lawyer could use to tie your property up in a challenge long enough that you'd run out of money fighting it. The room was quiet except for the wind and the gate. How do you know this? She said. Because I tried to buy Section 22 4 years ago, he said, when it came available before your husband purchased it. My attorney found the notation and told me to walk away from the deal unless the notation was cleared. Daniel didn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel had bought that land without an attorney because they couldn't afford one, because that was 18 years ago and they were young and they thought knowing the land was enough. Probably not, Gideon said. Elowen sat with her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the floor for a moment, not because she was giving up, because she was making herself hold still long enough to think. "Can it be cleared?" she said. "Yes. It requires filing a formal petition with the county land office and a surveyor's certification that the 74 boundaries are accurate. It's not complicated. It's just paperwork and it costs money." "How much money?" He named a figure. It wasn't an enormous amount. It was the kind of amount that would have been unremarkable 3 years ago, before the drought, before the cattle sales, before the candlesticks. Now it sat in the conversation like a stone. "I confront it," Gideon said, "against the creek access lease. We add it to the agreement." Elowen's jaw tightened. That wasn't in the original agreement. "No, it's an amendment. It changes the balance." "It changes the balance in your favor," he said. "You'd be paying it back through access fees you're already receiving." She knew he was right. She knew the math worked. She also knew that every amendment, every addition, every new layer of obligation was another thread tying her to a man whose help she needed and whose motives she still didn't fully understand. And that thread by thread was how people ended up somewhere they hadn't meant to go. "Let me think about it," she said. "All right. I'll think about it tonight and tell you tomorrow. I'm not stalling." "I didn't think you were," he said. "You don't strike me as a woman who stalls." She rode home in the early dark with the wind behind her and the ledger under her coat and a new line of worry running alongside everything else she was already carrying. She thought about it all night, which was to say she slept badly and woke up 3 times and lay there in the cold doing arithmetic in her head until the numbers settled into the shape she knew they were going to take. In the morning, she made the decision she'd already made and rode back east. Gideon was out on the range when she arrived, but Silas told her where, and she rode out and found him standing beside a water trough with Wade and another man she didn't know, looking at something in the bottom of it. She pulled up and waited until he looked up. "The amendment," she said. "I'll take it, but I'm adding a clause." He walked over to her horse. "What clause?" "If the county petition resolves in my favor and the notation is cleared, half the legal fee comes off the lease payments. The other half I pay back in cash at the end of the spring season." He looked up at her from the ground, and the morning light was doing something complicated to his expression. "You rode back out here to tell me that before breakfast," he said. "I decided last night. I didn't want to sit on it." "The clause is fair," he said. "I'll have it written up." "I'll write it up," she said. "You can review it." He almost smiled. "Of course you will." She turned her horse and started back toward the road, and she heard him say behind her, "Quiet." Not directed at her, the kind of thing a man says to himself or to the air. Silas was right about her. She didn't turn around, but she filed it. The legal petition took 11 days to prepare. Elowen found a surveyor in town named Mr. Hatch, who was old enough that he'd been involved in the original 1874 survey and still had his own records. He was not an easy man to deal with. He was meticulous to the point of obstruction, wanted everything in triplicate, and had an opinion about how the county land office filed things that he shared at length, whether you asked for it or not. But he was precise, and precision was what this required. She spent 3 days at his office going through records with him, matching his archived survey notes against her own property maps from the ledger. Hatch was skeptical of her maps at first, which she expected. "You drew these yourself?" he said, turning one of them sideways and then back again. "First year on the property," she said. "I walked every boundary and marked every feature. The scale is," he started. "Within 6 inches across the full 320, she said. "I checked it against the county grid when I had access to it in 1879. Hatch looked at her over his glasses. "Within 6 inches, he repeated. "Give or take." He put the map down carefully, the way you put down something you've just reassessed. "Mrs. Hartley, your husband was fortunate in his choice of wife. My husband was a good man who trusted the wrong thing sometimes," she said. "I don't need the compliment, Mr. Hatch. I need the petition." He got the petition done in 11 days, which she gathered was faster than usual. While the petition was in process, Gideon's men ran cattle across her creek crossing 3 times a week as agreed. She watched it happen the first time from the rise above the ford, counting the cattle, watching the bank, checking the behavior of the water downstream. The limestone shelf held. The bank was showing wear, but within the parameters they documented. She noted it in the ledger. On the 3rd crossing day, Gideon rode along with the drive. He came up to where she was standing on the rise and stopped his horse beside her, and they both watched the cattle work their way across the ford. It was a clean crossing. His men knew what they were doing. and the lead animals found the shelf without being pushed, and the rest followed. "Bank's holding," she said. "You've been checking it." "Every crossing day." "I know," he said. "Cord told me." She looked at him. "Are you having me watched?" "Cord mentioned it because he thought I'd want to know that you were documenting every crossing," Gideon said, without defensiveness. "He was right that I'd want to know. I'm telling you because you'd want to know that I know." She considered this. It was a strange kind of transparency. A man telling you that he'd received information about you, rather than using it quietly. She wasn't sure what to do with it. "The documentation protects both of us," she said. "If there's a dispute about bank conditions later, we both have records." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not objecting to it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the cattle. The last of the herd was crossing now, the drags being pushed through by 2 of Gideon's hands. "The petition should be filed by end of week," she said. "Hatch is good," Gideon said. "Slow usually, but good." "I told him I needed it in 11 days. He delivered in 11 days. "You told Hatch," Gideon stopped. "He took 2 weeks to file a straightforward boundary correction for me last spring." "I brought my property maps," she said. "He was impressed by the precision. I think he wanted to finish quickly so he could tell people about them." Gideon made a sound that she was fairly sure was a laugh, though he kept it brief. "You've been managing this county longer than you know." "I've been surviving this county," she said. "It's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe not, but the skills overlap." Below them, the last of the cattle cleared the ford and moved up the far bank, and the water settled back into its shape, and the creek ran on the way it always had, indifferent to the cattle and the crossings and the 2 people standing above it trying to figure out what they were to each other. The petition was accepted and filed on a Friday. The county land office's preliminary response came back the following Wednesday, which was faster than Hatch had predicted and faster than Elowen had let herself hope. The clerical hold had been, exactly as Gideon had described, a bureaucratic remnant, a notation made during a period of surveying disputes in 1871 that had never been formally closed because the dispute it referenced had resolved informally, rather than through official channels. Hatch's petition, supported by the original survey records and Elowen's property maps, was sufficient to resolve it. A formal clearance would be issued within 30 days. She rode to Gideon's ranch to tell him. He was at the work table again when she arrived, and he stood up when she came in, which was a small thing and probably automatic, but she noticed it. "It's clearing," she said. 30 days for the formal paperwork." He exhaled. Just slightly, just a small release of tension she hadn't known he'd been carrying about her situation. "Good," he said. "Once it's cleared, Sutter loses that angle." "He loses that specific angle," Gideon said. "He'll have others." "I know. He's not going to stop because the deed is clean." "I know that too." She sat down in the same chair as before, the one across from his work table. "I spent last night thinking about what he does next." Gideon sat back down. "Tell me." "He needs me to feel alone," she said. "That's the mechanism. Everything he does is designed to make me feel like fighting is futile, that no one will back me, that the system won't help me, that I'm a lone woman against something too large to beat. The fence fire, if that's what he tries. Any interference with my water access. Rumors in town about my financial situation." "He's already running the financial rumors," Silas said from the doorway. They both looked at him. "I heard it at the feed store this morning," Silas said, coming into the room. "Nothing specific, just the kind of talk that makes people think something is already decided, that the Hartley property is coming available." Elowen's hands tightened on the ledger in her lap. "He's setting up the story before the outcome," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Then we set up a different story." She opened the ledger. She'd been writing during the night, not just thinking, working out a set of steps in order, with the specific logic of someone who had spent 2 years understanding exactly which levers move things in this county. The creek crossing agreement is already public because Wade's crew was visible all week doing the fence work. People know you're operating on my land. "Yes," Gideon said. "What they don't know is that it's a formal documented lease, not charity, not a favor, a legal business arrangement between 2 ranching operations." She looked at him. "I want to record it with the county." He was still. "The agreement is already in writing," she said. "We both have copies. I'm saying register it. Make it a public county record, so that when Sutter runs his story about an available property, there's a contradicting record that says this land has active legal contracts in place." Gideon looked at the work table for a moment. She watched him think through it. That makes our arrangement public, he said. People will draw conclusions. Let them, she said. Let them conclude that you have a business interest in this property remaining in my hands. That's true. And it's a lot harder for Sutter to run the abandoned property narrative when there's a county registered lease agreement in your name tied to it. Silas made the small sound again that she'd cataloged as not quite a laugh. Gideon looked up at her. You worked this out last night. I work most things out at night. There's not much else to do. You're using my stake in the creek crossing as a shield, he said. I'm using our mutual documented interest as leverage. Yes. And if I'm not willing to have my name that publicly attached to your situation? It was a fair question. She'd asked it to herself last night, and she'd sat with it honestly rather than dismissing it. Then I'll find another way, she said. I'm not asking you to take on my fight. I'm asking if you're willing to let the truth of what we've already agreed to be publicly visible. He picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. Who takes the agreement to the county office, he said. I do, she said. You don't have to be there. I'll be there, he said. She looked at him. If we're going to do this, he said, we do it completely. You walk into that county office and you file that lease, and I'll be standing next to you when you do, so that anyone who sees it and draws conclusions doesn't just conclude that your property has legal contracts. They conclude that Gideon Rourke is paying attention. The room was very quiet. That's more than I asked for, she said. I know, he said. Does it change your answer? She thought about Malcolm Sutter walking through her door without knocking, dropping a paper on her table, calling her sweetheart. She thought about the fire at the Kemper place during a season with no lightning. She thought about her ledger and Hatch and his survey records and the 30-day clearance that was coming and the fence that was standing where it had been failing. No, she said. It doesn't change my answer. They filed the agreement the next morning. Gideon was there. He stood a half step back from the counter when Elowen set the documents down. Not behind her, not in front of her, just beside, the way a person stands when they're present but not taking over. The county clerk was a man named Burl Teasdale, who had lived in this county his entire life and knew everyone in it and would have the contents of this filing distributed through the social fabric of the community within 48 hours without being asked. Teasdale looked at the documents. He looked at Elowen. He looked at Gideon. His expression shifted through something complicated. Lease agreement, he said. Creek access on the Hartley property. That's correct, Elowen said. And you're both parties to this? We are, she said. Teasdale stamped the documents. He made 2 copies as required. He filed one and handed Elowen the other, and his eyes went to Gideon one more time with the look of a man doing math he wasn't going to say out loud. Have a good morning, Mrs. Hartley, he said. Thank you, Mr. Teasdale. They walked out of the county building into the October air, and Elowen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something specific and complicated that wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but was something in that neighborhood. A solidity, a sense that the ground under her feet was more real than it had been yesterday. He'll have told 3 people before we reach the horses, Gideon said. At least, she said. They walked in silence for a moment. Sutter will hear about it today, he said. I know. He won't take it well. No, she said. He won't. She untied her horse at the post and checked the girth, the way she always did. Not because she expected the girth to be wrong, but because she checked things. She had always checked things. It was what had kept her alive through 2 bad winters and 1 dead husband and every slow disaster in between. Elowen, Gideon said. She looked at him. He's going to escalate, he said. You know that. I know. Whatever he tries next won't be polite. It wasn't polite the first time, she said. He just hadn't gotten loud yet. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted. I'm ready for loud. She rode back toward her property with the filed copy of the lease agreement in her saddlebag and the ledger against her ribs and the cold October air on her face. And somewhere in the county, Malcolm Sutter was about to hear news that would change his calculations considerably. She wasn't afraid of that. She was, for the first time in 2 years, something closer to ready. Sutter's response came faster than she'd expected, and it didn't come to her directly. It came to her garden. She found it on a Monday morning, 4 days after the county filing. She walked out at first light the way she always did, checking the yard before anything else, and she stopped at the edge of the garden rows and stood there looking at what had been done. Someone had walked through it in the night. Not vandalized it exactly. Not pulled up, nothing dramatically destroyed, but walked through it deliberately, back and forth, with heavy boots, pressing the late-season plants down into the soil, crushing the stems methodically. The way you do if you wanted the damage to be clear and legible, but you also wanted to be able to say it might have been an animal. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk in straight lines. Elowen stood at the edge of it for a long moment. The cold morning air sat still around her. She didn't make a sound. Then she went inside, got the ledger, came back out, and documented everything. She measured the boot impressions where the soil had held them. A large boot wider than most, with a worn spot on the right heel that left a distinctive mark. She drew the pattern of the damage row by row. She noted the direction of travel and the approximate time window based on the state of the frost on the undisturbed soil versus the damaged sections. She wrote, "Deliberate. 2 passes north to south occurred between midnight and 4 a.m. based on frost line." She wrote, "This is not a warning. This is a test. He wants to see if I break." Then she got her tools and spent 2 hours doing what she could to salvage the plants, coaxing the bent stems back up, remounding the soil. Some of it would recover, some of it wouldn't. She didn't send word to Gideon that morning. She thought about it and decided against it because sending word every time something happened would establish a pattern of dependence that she couldn't afford, and because she needed to know what she would do alone before she decided what she needed from anyone else. What she did instead was ride to town. She went to the sheriff's office first. The sheriff was a man named Cord Pickett, no relation to the young ranch hand, just a shared name, who was in his 60s and had the exhausted patience of a man who had spent decades watching the same human failures repeat themselves. He listened to her description of the garden damage. He looked at the drawings in her ledger. He did not look like a man who was going to do very much. "Could have been kids," he said. "Kids don't walk in straight lines," she said. "Could have been a drunk." "The pattern is deliberate. I documented the boot impression. There's a distinctive heel wear pattern on the right boot." Pickett looked at her ledger again, at the drawings she'd made. He had the look of a man who was mildly impressed and trying not to show it because being impressed would complicate the stance he'd already taken. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "without a witness. I understand you can't arrest anyone today," she said. "I'm here to file a report. I want it on record that this damage occurred on this date with these characteristics. That's all I'm asking you to do." He filed the report. It took 10 minutes and cost her nothing but the time, and when she left his office, she had a report number written in her ledger below the documentation of the damage. A small thing. Another thread. Her second stop was at the hardware store, where she bought a chain and a padlock for the garden gate. There hadn't been a gate, just an open break in the fence row, but she'd planned to add one eventually. She bought it now and added the cost to the column in the ledger marked Sutter Expenses, which she had started the day after his first visit. She intended for that column to be useful later. Her third stop before she left town was the feed store, where she spent 20 minutes talking with the owner. A woman named Mrs. Clara Fenn, who was 58 years old, had been widowed herself 12 years ago and knew everything that moved through this county by name and direction. Elowen didn't tell her about the garden directly. She mentioned she'd had some trouble with foot traffic on her property at night and had filed a report with Pickett. She mentioned the county lease filing with a casualness that she'd practiced on the ride in. By the time she left Mrs. Fenn's store, she knew that the Creek lease filing had indeed made the rounds within 48 hours of Teasdale processing it, exactly as she and Gideon had predicted. She also knew that Sutter had been in town 2 days ago asking questions about the timeline for tax delinquency proceedings, which meant he was running multiple approaches simultaneously. And she knew one other thing, which was new. Sutter had a lawyer. His name was Denton Marsh, and he'd ridden in from Wichita 3 days ago and taken a room at the hotel. He was, according to Mrs. Fenn, a young man, well-dressed, with the smooth, unreadable manner of someone whose entire professional life was spent saying things that couldn't be proven to mean what they meant. A lawyer changed things. Elowen rode home faster than she'd ridden to town. She spent the afternoon rebuilding the garden gate. She had hinges in the barn from a previous project, and the lumber she needed came from a section of the old chicken coop that had been unusable for years. And she hung the gate and set the padlock and stood back and looked at it. It wasn't beautiful. The hinge placement was slightly off on one side and the lumber didn't match. But it latched and the padlock was good iron, and that was what mattered. She was in the barn when she heard hoofbeats. Not one rider, several. She came out of the barn with her rifle, old instinct, non-negotiable, and found Silas Boone and 2 ranch hands she recognized from the fence crew pulling up in the yard. Silas looked at the rifle and then at her face and then at the new gate on the garden. "Gideon sent us," he said. "How did he know?" "Teasdale's wife mentioned the garden situation to Wade's wife," Silas said. "This county talks, Mrs. Hartley." Elowen lowered the rifle. "I was going to tell him." He figured. Silas looked at the garden gate. You built that today? This afternoon. He got down from his horse. The two hands behind him did the same. We're going to do a perimeter walk, check the fence line, look at the approach roads, see what the night traffic looks like. She wanted to say she'd done her own perimeter checks. She wanted to say she didn't need 3 men from another operation walking her land like she was a problem to be managed. But she also understood the difference between pride and strategy, and 3 sets of experienced eyes on her perimeter in the hours after deliberate property damage was strategy, not charity. Stay out of the creek bank section, she said. I don't want the documentation disturbed. Yes, ma'am, Silas said. Gideon arrived the next morning before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. She heard his horse, and she was already at the door when he knocked, which meant she'd been listening for him, which she acknowledged to herself without embarrassment. Come in, she said. He came in, removed his hat, sat down at the table without being invited to. The first time he'd done that, she noticed, not disrespectfully, just like a man who had been in this kitchen enough times that he'd stopped performing the formality of waiting. Tell me about the lawyer, he said. She told him. She told him everything she'd gotten from Mrs. Fenn, and she told him about the report she'd filed with Pickett, and she told him about the boot impressions and the measurement and the heel pattern. She showed him the ledger entries. He read them without interrupting. Marsh, he said when she finished. I've heard the name. He works the Western Land Circuit. He's not a courtroom lawyer. He's a document lawyer. Challenges to surveys, title disputes, deed interpretations. He set the ledger down. If Sutter's brought him in, he's going for the paper. The deed notation, she said. It's the obvious move. The petition is filed, but the formal clearance isn't issued yet. There's a 30-day window, and Marsh will know that. If he can file a competing claim or a challenge to the survey before the clearance issues, can he do that? He can try. Whether it succeeds depends on the county land office and whether Hatch's petition is solid. Gideon looked at her. Is it solid? Hatch took 11 days and used his own original 1874 records, she said. It's solid. Then a challenge probably fails, but a challenge still costs you time and money to respond to. And Sutter is betting I run out of one before the clearance comes through. Yes. Elowen stood up and poured herself more coffee and didn't offer him any, which she'd stopped doing out of habit rather than unfriendliness. The coffee pot was nearly empty and she had 1 bag left in the cupboard. He didn't appear to notice or mind. I need to talk to Hatch, she said, today, and I need to know if there's an attorney in this county who can stand in front of whatever Marsh files. There's one, Gideon said. Franklin Adler. He's in Hayes. He's slow and he's expensive. How expensive? He named the figure. She sat with it. That's not in the lease amendment. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. I'm not offering, he said, which surprised her. I know you don't want that. I'm telling you what it costs so you know what we're working with. She thought she'd had him figured out, largely. She thought she'd understood the shape of him well enough to anticipate his moves. And then he'd do something like that. Decline to offer, refuse to take the easy, generous gesture that would have been the obvious thing. And she'd have to revise again. I have something, she said. She went to the bedroom and came back with a small wooden box that she set on the table without ceremony. She opened it. Inside were 3 items. A deed of gift from her parents, a folded letter, and a smaller envelope containing a single piece of paper that she unfolded and set flat on the table in front of him. It was a promissory note, her name on it, Daniel's name, signed by both of them, witnessed in the amount of $400, made out to the issuing bank in Topeka. Daniel's brother has been paying the interest on this, she said. He doesn't know what the principal looks like anymore. I've been corresponding with the bank directly. If I can contact them about the status and negotiate the terms, there may be equity I can access. She paused. It's not a clean solution, but it's mine, not yours. Gideon looked at the promissory note for a long time. Have you talked to the bank recently? He said. Not since July, when I had to tell them the cattle were gone. They know your situation. They know what I told them. What did you tell them? I told them I was solvent and working to recover, she said, which was true. I just didn't specify the timeline. He looked up at her. Elowen, he said, her first name, straight out, which he hadn't done before except that once in the field. The bank will have been approached by Sutter. That's standard practice for him. He identifies a struggling property, finds the debt holders, and makes sure they're in a nervous frame of mind before he goes back to the owner. The room was cold and very quiet. "The bank is already nervous," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably," he said. She closed the box. She didn't slam it. She closed it the way you close something you're trying to think past. The same careful way you put things down when your hands want to throw them. "All right," she said. "Then we deal with the bank and Marsh at the same time, and we do it before Sutter has both angles working against me simultaneously." "Yes," he said. "I need Adler." "I know. And I need him to understand that he's walking into a situation where someone is actively moving pieces on the board, not a standard title dispute." "I'll send word to Adler today," Gideon said. She looked at him. "I'll pay you back. Everything. Every penny." "I know you will," he said, without the slight patronizing weight that phrase usually carried, like it was just a fact he was acknowledging rather than a reassurance he was giving her. "That's not why He stopped. "Why you're what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat, which was on the table between them, and then out the window at the October yard. "I've done business in this county for 15 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of situations where someone needed help, and the help they got came with conditions that cost them more than the problem did. I don't want to be one of those situations for you." She looked at him for a long time. "You're telling me your motive," she said. "I'm trying to." "Most people don't do that. Most people have motives they can't say out loud," he said. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and set it down again. "Then I'll tell you mine. I need Adler because I will not let Malcolm Sutter take this land. Not because I'm sentimental about 320 acres of difficult soil. Not because Daniel built something here that I owe him to protect, though both of those things are true. But because the minute I sign that paper, every other struggling homesteader in this county learns that holding out is futile. They watch what happens to me, and they draw the conclusions Sutter needs them to draw." She looked at him directly. "That's why I'm fighting. Not just for my land, for what it means if I lose it." Gideon held her gaze for a long moment. "Then, let's not lose it," he said. Franklin Adler arrived from Hayes 4 days later, and he was not what Elowen had expected from Gideon's description. He was not slow-seeming. He was compact and quick-eyed, somewhere in his early 50s, and he had the manner of a man who had been underestimated often enough that he'd stopped correcting the impression because the gap between what people expected and what he could do was a professional asset. He sat at her kitchen table with the deed, the ledger, the survey maps, Hatch's petition documentation, and the filed lease agreement spread out in front of him, and he went through them methodically and without comment for 40 minutes while Elowen sat across from him and did not interrupt. At the end of 40 minutes, he looked up. "How much of this documentation did you produce yourself?" he said. "The maps, the ledger records, and the crossing documentation are mine," she said. "The survey petition is Hatch's, based on his own 1874 records plus my property maps." "Hatch used your maps in the petition." "Yes, he cited them in the survey notes." Adler made a sound that she interpreted as professional appreciation, restrained. "If Marsh files a challenge before the clearance issues," she said, "what does he have to work with?" "Less than he'd like," Adler said. "The 1871 notation was a clerical hold. There's no underlying legal dispute attached to it anymore. Hatch's documentation is thorough. A challenge would need to find an error in the 74 resurvey itself, and Hatch's original records are the authoritative source on that." He paused. "However, Marsh doesn't need to win. He needs to delay. If he files a challenge within the next 3 weeks, it creates a contested status on the property that the bank will treat as a reason to accelerate your debt obligation, which Sutter has already prepared them to do," Elowen said. Adler looked at her. "You knew about the bank approach." "I suspected it when Gideon mentioned Sutter's standard practice. I confirmed it 2 days ago." She'd written to the Topeka Bank the morning after her conversation with Gideon, a careful, precise letter that asked specific questions about the current status of their communications regarding her account. The reply had come faster than she'd expected, which told her someone at the bank was ready to respond because they'd been expecting to need to. The language in the reply was careful and formal and confirmed exactly nothing, which in its own way confirmed everything. "I need to get ahead of the bank before Marsh files," she said. "Can you make contact with them directly and establish that there's active legal counsel on this property?" "I can do that," Adler said. "A letter from counsel changes the bank's risk calculation. They don't want to be the instrument of a fraudulent land scheme any more than you want to be the victim of one. And if they understand that's what's happening, make them understand it," she said. "Use specific language. Use Sutter's name." Adler looked at her with the particular expression of a lawyer encountering a client who knows exactly what they want. "That's aggressive," he said. "I know. It will provoke a response." "I know that too," she said. "I want to provoke the response now, while we have time to answer it, rather than in 3 weeks when Marsh has already filed and the bank is in Sutter's pocket." Adler gathered the documents and began sorting them into the order he needed. "I'll need to take copies of the ledger entries related to Sutter's visits and the garden incident." "I've already made copies," she said, and pushed them across the table. He looked at the copies, neat, complete in her handwriting, and then at her. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "how long have you been a lawyer?" "I haven't," she said. "You've been practicing like one." "I've been surviving like one," she said. "It's different." The week that followed was the hardest stretch since Daniel died, and it was hard in a different way. Not the grinding exhaustion of physical survival, but the particular tension of waiting while other people moved pieces on a board she couldn't fully see. Adler filed his letter to the bank on a Wednesday. On Thursday, Sutter came back. He came in the evening this time, as the light was going, and he came alone. No hand, no agent, just Sutter himself on a gray horse, riding up the south road and stopping at the new fence line. He didn't open the gate. He sat on his horse and looked at the property for a long time, and Elowen watched him from the window without moving. Then he called out, "Mrs. Hartley." She didn't answer from the window. She went to the door and opened it and stood in the frame. "Sutter," she said, "I'd like to talk." "You're welcome to talk from there." He looked at the fence, the new fence, with the post set at the right depth and the wire run correctly. And then at the barn, with its repaired east slope, and then at the garden gate with the padlock on it. He was reading the property the way he had the first time she'd seen him, but the calculation was different now. "My offer stands," he said. "Same number." "My answer stands," she said. "Same word." "You've got a lawyer now," he said. "I do." "And Rourke's crew's been on your property." "Also correct." "You think that changes where this ends up?" It wasn't quite a question. "I think it changes quite a lot," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted under him, and he steadied it with the casual ease of a man who spent a great deal of time in the saddle. "The bank is going to call your note," he said. "That's not a threat, that's information. They're nervous about the property status, and they're going to move to protect themselves." "My attorney has been in contact with the bank," she said. Something moved across Sutter's face. A flicker, quickly controlled, but she was watching for it. "Adler," he said. He knew the name. Of course he did. "The bank understands the situation more clearly now," she said, "including the part about who has been attempting to influence their communication with me and why." The silence between them had a different quality than the last time. Before, his silences had felt like a man waiting for her to flinch. This one felt like a man recalculating. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. "No," she said. "I'm making it exactly as complicated as it is. You've been simplifying it by assuming I was alone in it. I'm not alone in it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've acquired 43 properties in this territory," he said. 43. "I know," she said. "I looked into it. Not one of them went the way mine is going," she said. "I know that too." He pulled his horse's head around. "This isn't finished." "I didn't think it was," she said. "Good night, Mr. Sutter." She watched him ride down the south road until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went inside and wrote down every word she remembered from the conversation, with the time and the date and the fact that he'd come alone and in the evening, which was its own kind of information. She wrote, "He is concerned about the bank contact that landed." She wrote, "He mentioned 40 feet properties. He wanted me to feel the weight of that number." She wrote, "He is accustomed to people breaking before he has to break them. He does not know what to do when they don't." She sat looking at that last line for a while. Then she added, "Neither do I entirely, but I'm still here." Marsh filed his challenge 8 days later. Adler had anticipated it, had in fact told her the likely filing date based on the standard legal calendar and Marsh's known working style. But anticipating it didn't make the notice any easier to hold. It was delivered by a county deputy on a Tuesday morning, a formal document in Marsh's careful hand citing the 1871 clerical notation and challenging the validity of Hatch's petition on procedural grounds. Not substantive grounds. He couldn't challenge the substance because the substance was solid, but procedural ones. He was arguing that the petition had been filed without proper notice to adjacent landholders. Elowen read the challenge twice. Then she sent word to Adler. Adler's response came the next morning, and it was calm in the way that someone is calm when they have been waiting for exactly this move. The notice requirement he's citing applies to contested boundary surveys. Adler wrote, Hatch's petition was a clearance of a clerical notation, not a boundary survey. Wrong statute. I'll file the objection today. She sent the reply to Gideon as well, not because she needed him to manage it, but because he was a party to the lease agreement that was tied to this property, and he'd been standing at the county office when she filed, and she had decided, sometime in the week since then, without formally deciding, that keeping him informed was the right thing to do. His response came back through Silas that same afternoon. Gideon says, tell Adler good, and tell him to CC the response to Teasdale's office. She looked at that for a moment. Getting the objection into Teasdale's office meant it would be in the public record and in the county gossip within 48 hours, which meant the story circulating in this county would be that Marsh had filed on the wrong statute and Adler had caught it in a day. That was not nothing. She sent word back to Adler to CC Teasdale. The objection was filed on a Thursday. By Saturday, she'd heard from 3 people independently. Mrs. Fenn, the man at the hardware store, and a neighboring homesteader named Pete Callahan who lived 6 miles north and who stopped by on some pretext about a shared fence line that turned out to be a pretext for checking on her. That the story was out. People knew Marsh had filed on the wrong statute. People knew Adler had answered it in a day. People were drawing the conclusion that Sutter's legal strategy was not going as smoothly as his 43 previous acquisitions might have led him to believe. Callahan stood in her yard with his hat in his hands and said, in the particular roundabout way that a man expresses something he doesn't quite know how to say directly, my brother's property is up on Section 31. Sutter's agent came by in September. I told my brother to wait before he signed anything. Tell your brother to talk to Adler, Elowen said. Callahan nodded slowly. You think he'd take another case? I think what's happening to your brother is the same thing that's been happening to me, she said. And I think if Adler has 2 cases instead of 1, the picture he can draw for a judge is considerably more complete. Callahan put his hat back on. He stood there for another moment with the look of a man who had come to check on someone and found them considerably more on top of things than he'd expected. You've been busy, he said. Yes, she said. Daniel would have... He started, and then stopped himself, the way people always stop themselves when they started a sentence about Daniel around her, suddenly uncertain of where it was going and whether she wanted it to arrive. Daniel would have done it differently, she said. He was a better hand with cattle than I am, and he had more patience for people than I do. This way is the way I know. Callahan nodded. I'll tell my brother. He left, and Elowen stood in the yard watching him go, and then she looked at her repaired fence and her padlocked garden gate and the barn with its straight east slope, and she thought about Pete Callahan's brother and the Kemper family's fence fire and 43 properties and a lawyer who'd filed on the wrong statute. She went inside and wrote a letter to Adler about Section 31. Then she made herself eat something because she'd been forgetting to eat with regularity, and she knew from the drought years that the body kept a tally on that kind of neglect and eventually presented the bill without warning. She ate, and she wrote, and outside the October dark came down cold and complete, and somewhere in this county, Malcolm Sutter was sitting with the knowledge that this particular property was not going the way any of his others had gone, and that the woman holding it was not alone, and that the walls he'd built around her were developing gaps he hadn't planned for. She didn't feel victorious. It was too early for that, and she'd lived long enough to know that early relief was how you got caught off guard. But she felt something. She felt like a woman who had been fighting in the dark for a long time and had just found, if not a light exactly, then the shape of the walls around her. Enough to know where the door was and what it would take to reach it. Adler's objection to Marsh's procedural challenge was sustained by the county land office on a Friday morning, 12 days after Marsh had filed it. Elowen heard about it from Adler's letter, which arrived the same afternoon. She read it standing at the door, still in her work coat, and then she folded it and put it in the ledger and went back to what she'd been doing, which was patching the north wall of the barn where the wind had found a gap between 2 boards. She finished the patch before she let herself think about what the ruling meant. It meant Marsh had failed on his first move. It meant the 30-day clearance window was still running, undisturbed, and that Hatch's petition was intact. It also meant Sutter would know by end of day and that whatever came next would not be procedural. She drove the last nail into the patch and climbed down from the ladder and stood in the cold barn and let herself feel, for about 30 seconds, the particular relief of a person who has been waiting for something to go wrong and has just learned it went right instead. 30 seconds was what she allowed herself. It wasn't a victory. It was one move in a longer game, and the man playing the other side had 43 properties behind him and a lawyer still on retainer and money she couldn't match. But it was something. She went inside and wrote Adler back and told him about Pete Callahan's brother on Section 31 and asked him directly whether he was willing to take a second case and whether 2 cases together would give him what he needed to approach the situation as a pattern rather than an isolated dispute. Adler had used the word pattern himself in their first meeting, the pattern being Sutter's operating method, and she'd been thinking about that word ever since, about what a pattern meant legally versus what it meant in ordinary life. In ordinary life, a pattern was something you recognized and warned people about. In law, a pattern was evidence. Adler's reply came 3 days later. Yes, he would take the Callahan case. Yes, 2 cases together changed what he could do in front of a judge. He'd been in contact with 2 other attorneys in neighboring counties who had seen similar situations and were willing to share documentation. He named a figure for the additional work. Elowen looked at the figure. Then she rode to Gideon's ranch. She found him in the east pasture rather than the house, overseeing a late-season fence repair of his own. A section of his upper line had been hit by something in the night, post pulled rather than broken, the kind of damage that didn't look accidental. She pulled up beside him and looked at the damage and then at him. When? She said. 2 nights ago, he said. He had the particular flat expression of a man who is angry and is keeping it managed. 3rd post from the corner. The wire was cut, not broken. Did you file a report? He looked at her. I know, she said. You're not a widow on a struggling homestead. It reads differently for you. I filed a report, he said, with a slight edge that wasn't directed at her. Pickett came out yesterday. What did he say? Could have been vandals, Gideon said. Elowen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It's the same message, she said. He's showing you that your association with my situation has a cost. I understood the message, he said. Are you... She started and then stopped because what she'd been about to ask was whether he was reconsidering his involvement, and she didn't want to ask it in a way that sounded like she needed reassurance, because she didn't, or in a way that sounded like she wouldn't understand if his answer was yes, because she would. No, he said, before she finished. He looked at her directly. If that's what you were going to ask? It was. Then no. He turned back to the fence. Tell me what you came to tell me. She told him about Adler's letter, about the Callahan case, about the figure Adler had named for the expanded work. She told him without softening the number, because she'd learned that Gideon Rourke responded poorly to softened numbers. He wanted the actual figure, and he wanted it straight. He listened without interrupting. Adler thinks the pattern case changes what he can do, she said. 2 properties, same operator, same methods, documented timeline. He said the word fraud is possible if we can show coordinated intent. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He pulled the cut wire back to the post and held it there with one hand, looking at the break point. The fence fire at the Kemper place, he said. Was it documented? I don't know. I've been trying to find out. Kemper moved to Missouri after he sold, Silas said from behind them. She hadn't heard him ride up. He had the quality, she'd noticed, of appearing without announcing himself. Not sneakily, but just quietly, as though noise was something he produced only when it was necessary. His wife's family is still in Dodge. I can ride down and ask about what records they kept. Elowen looked at him. Then she looked at Gideon. If we can establish 3 properties, she said. Not 2. Adler's pattern becomes a pattern with legs, Gideon said. Yes. Gideon looked at Silas. Ride to Dodge. Take cord. Don't go alone. Talk to the Kemper family and find out what they have. Silas nodded and turned his horse without further comment. Elowen watched him go. Then she said, He does that a lot. Appears, listens, and leaves. He's the best ranch manager I've ever employed, Gideon said, and the least interested in being told things he can figure out himself. I understand the appeal, she said. He looked at her sideways, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Adler's figure, he said, returning to it. I'll cover it. Against the lease. Against the lease, he agreed. I'm adding it to the amendment. The amendment is getting long, she said. It is, he said. Do you object? She thought about it honestly, rather than just reflexively. The amendment had started as a legal filing fee. It now included barn repair, fence rebuild materials, the initial petition cost, and was about to include Adler's expanded case fees. Each item had been documented, justified, and attached to the existing lease agreement that was itself registered with the county. The paper trail was clear. The obligations were clear. Nothing had been given without documentation, and nothing had been received without a corresponding entry in her ledger. It was the most financially entangled she'd been with another person since Daniel. "No," she said. "I don't object." "Good." He finished examining the cut wire and stepped back. "Because I want to talk to you about something else." She waited. "The railroad survey," he said. She went still. "I've been hearing things for 2 months," he said. "I didn't mention it earlier because I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to give you more to think about when you already had enough. But the survey team was in this section last week, and the route they're looking at runs along the South Creek corridor. The South Creek corridor, her creek, her crossing, her 320 acres that sat directly across the path of what he was describing. If the railroad comes through that corridor," she said slowly, "your land value triples," he said. "Minimum. Possibly more, depending on whether they need a depot site or a water stop." The October wind moved through the broken fence line, and she stood in it and understood all at once the full shape of what Sutter had been doing. He hadn't just wanted her land because it was available. He'd wanted it because he knew what was coming. He knew about the railroad, she said. He had to have known. The survey was quiet, but it wasn't invisible. A man with his connections and his pattern of acquisition. He's been buying corridor land, she said. All 43 properties, not opportunistically, strategically. Gideon nodded. She thought about the number. 43 properties along a railroad survey route. 43 families pressured or frightened or worn down into selling land that was about to become worth significantly more than they'd been paid for it. 43 times this exact situation, and only once, here, on her 320 acres of difficult soil beside a limestone creek crossing, had it not gone the way he'd planned. "Does Adler know about the railroad?" she said. "Not yet." "He needs to know today." She was already turning her horse. "This changes the fraud case from a property dispute to something considerably larger. If Sutter was acquiring land along a known railroad survey route while withholding that information from sellers, that's material misrepresentation in every transaction," Gideon said. "At minimum. Adler needs to know," she said again, "and he needs to know before Sutter realizes we've made the connection." She rode hard back to her property, wrote the letter to Adler in 20 minutes. The fastest she'd ever written a letter, though she made herself reread it once to make sure the information was organized correctly. And sent it with one of Gideon's hands, who was heading toward Hayes anyway. Then she sat down at the table with her ledger and opened it to a blank page and started drawing a map. Not her property map, a different map. The county, as she knew it, with every property she'd heard Sutter's name connected to marked with an X. She knew 6 of the 43 herself, from conversations and county records she'd looked at during her own research. She wrote letters to Adler, Callahan, Mrs. Fenn, and 2 other people who knew the county well and asked them each to tell her every Sutter acquisition they knew of and the approximate dates. The replies came back over 4 days, and she added each property to her map. By the time she finished, 21 of the 43 properties were marked, and they formed a line. Not a perfect line. The kind of line that actual terrain makes when a railroad survey follows a creek corridor and a ridgeline and the practical geography of moving heavy equipment through difficult country. A line with curves and justs, but a line nonetheless. She took the map to Gideon. He stood at his work table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You did this in 4 days," he said. "I had help from people who know the county. Still." He traced the line with his finger, not touching the paper. 21 of them. "There are 22 more I haven't placed yet," she said, "but the line is already clear." He looked up at her. "Adler can use this. Adler can use this in a way that doesn't just help me or the Callahans," she said. "If this map goes in front of a judge with the survey route overlaid, if someone can obtain the survey route, I can obtain it," Gideon said. She looked at him. "I have a relationship with the Railroad Survey Office," he said. "I've been in communication with them about the corridor's impact on my own grazing routes. I can ask for the official route documentation as a direct stakeholder." "Can you do that without alerting Sutter?" "Sutter doesn't have relationships with the survey office," Gideon said. "He has relationships with people who have relationships. It's slower than going directly. Yes, I can do it without alerting him." He looked at the map again. "This changes the scope of what Adler is working with considerably." It changes the scope of what this has always been, she said. We were looking at a property dispute. This is a scheme. It's been a scheme from the beginning. 43 families, a railroad route, and one man who knew what the land was worth and made sure they didn't. The room was quiet. He came to you 3 months after the survey, Gideon said. Late to you compared to some of the others. Why? She'd thought about this. The deed notation. He knew about it from his research into the property. I thought it would make me easy to dislodge legally, so he saved the legal approach for last. He didn't need to rush. He thought he had a mechanism. And instead, it gave us 3 months to build the case around him. Yes, she said. Gideon was looking at her in a way she'd started to notice and hadn't yet decided what to do with. Not romantic exactly, or not only that, but the way a person looks at someone when they are genuinely surprised by them, repeatedly, and have stopped trying to hide that they're surprised. You're not who he thought he was dealing with, Gideon said. Nobody is who Sutter thinks he's dealing with, that, she said. He looks at people in difficult situations and he sees the difficulty. He stops there. She looked at the map. He doesn't ask what a person knows or what they've built or what they'll do when they've got nothing left to lose. The formal deed clearance came through on a Thursday, 28 days after Hatch's petition was filed. Elowen was in the yard when Adler's rider brought it, and she sat down on the porch step and read the document through twice before she stood up again. The clerical notation was formally cleared. Her deed was clean and unencumbered. There was nothing in the county record that Marsh could use, nothing Sutter could point to, nothing that could be shaken loose with a legal challenge on procedural grounds or any other grounds. She was sitting there when she heard a second rider, and she looked up expecting Adler's man returning and instead found Gideon at the gate. He had the railroad survey documentation in his hand. He held it up so she could see it from the porch. She stood up. He came through the gate, latching it as he always did, as he'd done the very first morning, and walked up to the porch and handed her the document. She looked at the survey route, marked in red ink on a county map. It ran along the South Creek corridor. It ran directly across her property. More precisely, it ran directly across the limestone ford, her creek crossing, the one in the registered lease agreement, the one Gideon needed for his cattle operation and Sutter had needed to control. She looked at the map for a long time. The ford, she said, the most reliable water crossing in the South Corridor for 6 miles in either direction, he said. The railroad will need it, not for the track. The track curves north of it, but for the construction water supply during the build, and after, for maintenance access. They'll want to purchase access rights, she said, or an easement, he said. Either way, they'll pay for it. She sat down on the porch step again, not because she was weak, but because the full weight of what she was holding, the clearance letter in one hand, the survey map in the other, required a moment to carry correctly. He was going to buy this property, clear the deed himself, and then sell the water access to the railroad, she said. At a substantial profit over what he paid you, Gideon said, while my cattle operation lost access to the only reliable fall crossing in this section, yes. He sat down on the step beside her, not close, but beside, in the companionable way of two people who have been in enough difficult situations together that proximity no longer requires a reason. I didn't know about the railroad angle when I first came to talk to you about the crossing. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. I came because I needed the ford. I stayed because he paused in a way that was uncharacteristic of him. He was not, in her experience, a man who paused, because the situation became something I couldn't walk away from. She looked at the survey map. Adler has the map I drew, she said, and now he has this, the official route. Yes. With 21 documented properties along the line and the Kemper documentation that Silas is bringing back from Dodge. Silas got back this morning, Gideon said. The Kemper family kept records. Mrs. Kemper was, apparently, also a woman who wrote things down. Elowen thought about Mrs. Kemper, whom she'd never met, who had kept records in a different ledger in a different house and had ultimately signed the paper Elowen had refused to sign, and who was now living in Missouri with her family while Sutter held the property that should have been hers. What did Adler say when you sent him the survey route, she said. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell Mrs. Hartley that what we have now is not a property dispute. It is a federal matter." The wind moved through the yard, and the garden gate rattled on its hinges, the slightly imperfect gate she'd built herself from barn lumber and mismatched hinges. And the barn stood with its repaired roof, and the fence ran straight and properly set around the perimeter of her 320 acres of difficult soil. Federal matter. She turned the phrase over in her mind. A federal matter meant the railroad company itself had standing. It meant the interstate commerce implications gave jurisdiction to courts beyond the county level. It meant Sutter's 43 acquisitions laid out along a railroad survey route with documented evidence of material misrepresentation to sellers were not a local land dispute that a county judge might or might not feel motivated to pursue. It was a completely different scale of problem for Malcolm Sutter. "He doesn't know we have the survey route," she said. "Not yet. How long before he finds out? If Adler moves quickly, a week, maybe less." Gideon looked at her. "Adler wants to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Commissioner before Sutter has a chance to adjust his position. The complaint, combined with the railroad documentation, forces a response from authorities that are substantially larger than Sutter is." "What does he need from me?" "A signed statement from you documenting the timeline of Sutter's approach, the specific representations he made, and the methods he used, verbatim where possible." She almost smiled. "I have all of that." "I know," he said. "That's what Adler said when I told him." He said, "Of course she does." She looked at the survey map one more time, then folded both documents, the clearance and the map, and put them inside the ledger. She stood up. "I'll write the statement today," she said. "There's one other thing," Gideon said. He hadn't stood up yet. He was still sitting on the step with his hat between his hands, which was an uncharacteristic posture for him. He was a man who held himself straight as a matter of habit. "I want to say something that isn't about the legal situation." She looked down at him. "I came to your door 3 weeks ago because I needed a creek crossing," he said. "That was the honest reason. Everything after that has been, I've been involved because the situation warranted it, and because your fight is connected to my interests, and those are both true." He turned his hat over in his hands. "But they're not the only reasons I've been here." She stood on the porch of the house she'd held through 2 droughts and 1 husband's death and a land scheme she hadn't known the full shape of until 3 days ago. And she looked at this man sitting on her step with his hat in his hands, and she thought about Daniel, who had been good with cattle and patient with people and who had trusted the wrong thing sometimes, and who she had loved the way you love a person you've built a life beside even when the building is hard. She thought about what it meant to be here, in this specific place, still. "I know," she said. He looked up. "I've known for a while," she said. "I've been thinking about what to do with it." "And?" "I haven't decided yet," she said. "Ask me when this is finished." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once in the way that meant he accepted that answer and wasn't going to push past it. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on and stood up. "I'll tell Silas to have the Kemper documentation ready for Adler," he said. "I'll have the statement written by morning," she said. He walked back down to the gate, unlatched it, went through, latched it behind him, got on his horse, looked back at her once, then he rode east. The statement took her all night. Not because she didn't know what to write. The ledger had it all. Every date, every word she could remember, every observation about Sutter's manner and methods, and the specific ways he'd tried to make her feel that fighting was futile. It took all night because she was meticulous about it, because she understood that a document like this would be read by people who didn't know her and would form their understanding of her credibility from the quality of the writing, and she would not give them anything vague or emotional or imprecise to question. She wrote it in the plain, declarative style she used for her ledger. This happened on this date in these words with these witnesses where applicable. She cited the filed reports. She cited the county lease registration. She cited the garden damage documentation and the boot impression measurements. She cited Sutter's verbatim statements as she had recorded them in the hours after each visit. At the end of the statement, she attached a note for Adler. "The garden incident may seem minor in the context of what you are now building. I include it because it establishes the intimidation pattern at its earliest point. A man who sends someone to walk through a woman's garden in the night is a man who intends to send other messages later. The garden was the first message. Everything after is escalation. I believe that the pattern of escalation, documented in sequence, tells a story that individual incidents do not." She paused and looked at that last paragraph. Then she let it stand. She sealed the statement at 5 in the morning when the first gray light was starting outside and the fire had burned down to coals. She put it with the ledger. She remade the fire. She made coffee. She sat at the table in the early quiet and thought about what was coming. Adler's complaint to the land commissioner, the railroad company's likely involvement once the survey route connection became official, the size of what Malcolm Sutter was about to face from directions he hadn't anticipated when he'd pushed open her door without knocking. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in the deep, specific way of someone who has been running on necessity for so long that the absence of immediate crisis doesn't read as rest, but as a strange, unfamiliar quiet that she didn't quite know what to do with yet. She thought about what she'd told Gideon. Ask me when this is finished. She thought about what finished would look like and whether she'd recognize it when she arrived there and what she'd find on the other side of it. Outside, the frost was heavy on the garden and the new fence stood straight in the early light and the barn roof showed no gaps. She drank her coffee and waited for morning to come fully, and she sat with the question of what came next, the way she sat with all difficult things, steadily, without flinching, with the ledger open beside her and enough ink in the well to write it down when she found out. Adler filed the complaint with the Territorial Land Commissioner on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the news had moved through the county the way serious news moves, not loudly, not in the cheerful, gossiping way that ordinary information travels, but in the low, serious undertone of people who understand that something significant has shifted and aren't yet sure what it means for them personally. Elowen heard about the filing from Adler's letter, which arrived the same morning she heard about it secondhand from Mrs. Fenn, who sent a note with her neighbor's boy that said only, "People are talking. Come see me when you can." She went to see Mrs. Fenn that afternoon. The feed store was empty of other customers when she arrived, which she suspected was not entirely coincidental. Clara Fenn had a gift for arranging the conditions of a conversation she wanted to have. She was a practical woman who had run her business alone for 12 years and had developed, over those 12 years, a detailed and accurate map of this county's social and financial landscape. "Teasdale's been getting questions," Mrs. Fenn said, without preamble, pouring coffee that Elowen hadn't asked for but accepted gratefully. "About what's registered on your property, about the lease, about the clearance." "Who's asking?" 3 different people, none of whom usually take an interest in county land records. Mrs. Fenn sat down across from her. "One of them works for the Railroad Survey Office." Elowen set her cup down. "The railroad already knows," she said. It wasn't a question exactly, but she hadn't expected it this fast. When a territorial land commissioner receives a complaint that involves 43 properties along a railroad survey corridor, Mrs. Fenn said, with the calm tone of a woman who had clearly been thinking this through, "I imagine the railroad hears about it fairly quickly." "The railroad has its own interest in what Sutter was doing," Elowen said. "If he was acquiring water access rights along the construction corridor without disclosing the survey information to sellers, the railroad didn't want to pay for what he was going to charge them," Mrs. Fenn said simply. He was going to be sitting between the railroad and what it needed, and he was going to make them pay a great deal for the privilege. She said it the way someone says the thing that everybody has been thinking but nobody has said out loud yet. "Yes," Elowen said. "So the railroad has reason to want him stopped," Mrs. Fenn said, "which means your complaint to the land commissioner just acquired a very large ally that has considerably more resources than Malcolm Sutter." Elowen sat with that. The landscape of the situation had been shifting for weeks, each new piece of information changing the shape of what she was fighting and what she was fighting with. But this was a different order of shift. A railroad company with construction contracts and federal charter and the specific financial interest in clearing Sutter's land acquisitions from the corridor was not the same as a widow and a rancher and a careful attorney. This was something Sutter had not planned for, because he'd been planning for her specifically, for her isolation, her limited resources, her inability to sustain a prolonged fight. He had not planned for the chain of consequences that began with a woman who wrote everything down. "How is Pickett taking it?" Elowen said. Mrs. Fenn's expression said something her words didn't need to. Burl Teasdale had the land commissioner's inquiry letter on his desk yesterday, and Pickett had a visit from 2 men from the railroad survey office this morning. Pickett takes things the way Pickett always takes things, slowly and with great attention to which way the wind is blowing before he commits to a position. She paused. "The wind has shifted considerably." "It has," Elowen agreed. She rode home with more to think about than she'd arrived with, which was becoming a familiar condition. The November cold was settling in now, not the sharp, dramatic cold of a hard freeze, but the steady, grinding cold that meant winter was done announcing itself and had simply moved in. She could see her breath and her horse's breath in the air ahead of them as they moved down the south road toward the property. She was 200 yards from the gate when she saw Sutter's gray horse. He was at the fence again, the same position as his last visit, sitting on his horse, with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting long enough to get past impatience and arrive somewhere colder. He was watching her come down the road, and he didn't move as she approached. She pulled up 12 feet from him. He looked older than the first time she'd seen him. Not dramatically, a few weeks couldn't do that, but in the specific way that people look older when something they've built is coming apart and they know it and haven't yet decided what to do about knowing it. "You filed with the land commissioner," he said. "My attorney filed," she said, "on my behalf and on behalf of several other landholders. The railroad is involved now. I'm aware." He looked at the fence. He looked at the barn. He looked at the garden gate with its padlock, which she'd left locked since the night his man had walked through her plants in the dark. Something moved across his face that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of regret, though she wasn't sure Sutter had the mechanism for regret exactly. What he had was calculation, and the calculation was running hard right now behind his eyes. "I want to discuss a resolution," he said. "A resolution," she repeated. "The complaint can be withdrawn." "It can't," she said. "It's a territorial matter now. It's not mine to withdraw." He absorbed that. "There are people in this situation who were compensated fairly," he said. "People who wanted to sell. There are people in this situation who were not told that what they were selling was worth considerably more than what you paid them," she said, "because you had information they didn't have, and you chose not to share it." "That's business," he said, and the flatness of it, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that a line had been crossed, told her more about him than anything else he'd said in all their conversations. "Yes," she said, "and what's happening now is also business. The railroad's business, the land commissioner's business, and eventually I expect a judge's business." "You're a stubborn woman," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't quite an insult either. It was the assessment of a man who has encountered a variable that didn't behave the way his model predicted. "I've been called worse," she said. He sat for a long moment. "The Hartley property," he said finally. "You're going to stay." "That was never in question," she said. He pulled his horse's head around, the same motion as last time, the departure that was supposed to feel chosen rather than forced. This time it felt less convincing, and she thought maybe he felt that too, because he paused before he rode off in a way he hadn't paused before. She didn't feel the pause. He rode south, and she watched him go, and this time when he disappeared around the bend, she didn't feel the particular watchful dread she'd felt at the end of every previous encounter. What she felt was tired. Not defeated tired. The other kind. The tiredness of someone who has been in a long fight and can see the shape of the end of it, and the end is going to require more work, but it is the end. She opened the gate, went through, latched it behind her, and went inside. The formal proceedings took 11 weeks. Later, when people asked her about those 11 weeks, she would have difficulty describing them in a way that captured the actual experience, because the actual experience was not dramatic in the way that the preceding months had been dramatic. It was administrative. It was letters and responses and filings and Adler explaining procedural steps in terms she had to read twice to fully follow, and long rides to Hayes for meetings with people she didn't know, and depositions in a cold room with a court reporter whose pen scratched continuously in the background like a kind of mechanical conscience. She gave her deposition on a Wednesday in December. She brought the ledger. The attorney for the land commissioner, a woman named Ruth Garfield, which surprised Elowen in a way she was slightly ashamed of being surprised, looked at the ledger the way Hatch had looked at the property maps, with the specific attention of a professional encountering documentation that exceeds what they expected. "You maintained this record contemporaneously," Garfield said. "These entries were made on the dates indicated, not reconstructed afterward?" "Every entry is dated and was made within hours of the events it describes," Elowen said. "You can verify it against the filed reports and the county registration documents, which are all dated independently." Garfield looked at the boot impression drawings. She looked at the verbatim transcriptions of Sutter's visits. She looked at the Sutter expenses column and the timeline Elowen had constructed during the 4 nights after Gideon showed her the railroad survey route. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, "did anyone advise you to keep records in this manner?" "No," Elowen said. "I keep records because I run a ranch alone and there's no one to remember things for me." Garfield looked at her for a moment with an expression that Elowen couldn't fully read, but that felt like recognition of some kind. Then she went back to the ledger. The deposition lasted 4 hours. Silas brought the Kemper documentation from Dodge, and it turned out that Mrs. Kemper, whose first name was Agnes, and who Elowen felt an unexpected kinship with across the distance, had kept a journal that included 2 entries describing visits from Sutter's agent that were nearly identical in method to Sutter's visits to Elowen. The agent had never mentioned the railroad. The agent had described the land as difficult and the market as uncertain and the offer as generous given conditions. Agnes Kemper's journal entries, combined with Elowen's ledger and the county records and the railroad survey route documentation, were what Adler later described as the spine of the case. Around that spine, he and Garfield built a picture of 43 acquisitions, 26 of which they could directly document, all of them along the survey corridor, all of them involving a seller who had no knowledge of the railroad and a buyer who did. Marsh filed 3 additional challenges during the 11 weeks. Adler answered each one. Elowen stopped tracking them individually because Adler had the handles on them and she had a ranch to run, and the winter was not going to wait for legal proceedings to conclude before requiring her attention. She planted winter wheat in November, a calculated risk, a small acreage, the seed money coming from the first lease payment from Gideon's cattle crossing. She rebuilt the southeast corner of the garden fence herself, properly this time, with the right lumber and the hinges set at the correct angle so the gate didn't drag. She ordered 2 heifers from a neighboring operation with money she'd been saving since August, and she brought them in before the first real snow, and she stood in the barn, looking at them in the cold lantern light, and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not happiness, not yet, but the specific sensation of a life that was moving forward rather than holding still against collapse. Gideon came by twice a week, sometimes more. The creek crossing agreement had technically concluded when the cattle drive ended for the season, but he kept coming. He helped her haul feed when the snow made it difficult with one horse, which she accepted without too much internal debate because hauling feed in the snow alone was genuinely difficult and pride was not worth a pulled muscle. He sat at her table and drank her coffee and talked about ranch management, about water table conditions, about the railroad and what it would mean for the corridor when the construction began. He did not bring up what he'd said on the porch step again. She had told him to ask when it was finished, and it wasn't finished yet, and he was a man who kept his word. She respected that more than she expected to. One evening in January, when the snow was heavy and he'd stayed later than usual because the conditions outside had worsened while they were talking, she made supper without announcing that she was doing it, and he ate it without making it into something larger than it was. And they sat afterward in the warmth of the rebuilt fire, and she thought about how strange it was that a person could become a fixture in your life without a ceremony marking the moment it happened. "You've been quieter this week," he said. "I've been thinking," she said. "About the case?" "About after the case," she said. He was quiet, waiting. "I've been thinking about what this property is," she said. "What it can actually be if I'm not spending all my energy just keeping it from disappearing." She looked at the fire. "The railroad access easement, if it comes through on fair terms, gives me a capital position I haven't had since we bought the land. The winter wheat is a gamble, but the south fields have better drainage than anyone who hasn't walked them in all 4 seasons would know. I've been doing calculations about a small herd, not what we had before, something different, something that fits what the land can actually support, rather than what we always assumed it should support." "Show me the calculations," he said. She got the ledger. They sat at the table for 2 hours going through it, and at some point during those 2 hours, it stopped being a presentation and became a conversation. Him pushing back on the herd size estimate, her explaining the drainage patterns and why they changed the grazing math, him asking about the south field soil composition, her pulling out the property map she'd drawn in the first year and showing him why the conventional wisdom about that field was wrong. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at the map spread across the table. "You've been carrying this for 14 years, he said. "What?" "This knowledge, everything you know about this land. You've been carrying it the whole time and using it just to survive." He looked at her. "It's worth more than that." She thought about what it had cost to know what she knew. The years, the seasons, the watching and measuring and writing down. The 14 years of paying attention to 320 acres of difficult soil because no one else was going to do it. "I know," she said. "I'm starting to understand what to do with that." The land commissioner's ruling came down in February on the coldest day of the year, when the temperature was low enough that the ink in her pen required warming before it would flow. She read the ruling at the kitchen table. Malcolm Sutter and his associated entities were found to have engaged in a systematic material misrepresentation in the acquisition of properties along the Territorial Railroad Survey corridor. The ruling identified 26 confirmed transactions. Remedies included mandatory disclosure to all affected sellers, a right of repurchase at the original sale price plus accrued interest for any seller who wished to exercise it, and referral to the federal court for further proceedings regarding the interstate commerce implications. Marsh's legal fees would not be recoverable. Sutter's petition for dismissal was denied. Elowen read the ruling twice. Then she put it in the ledger, in the section behind all the entries that had led to it. The verbatim transcriptions of Sutter's visits, the boot impression drawings, the Sutter expenses column, the maps, the timeline, the 4-hour deposition in the cold room. She closed the ledger. She sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, with the fire going and the snow outside and the 2 heifers in the barn and the winter wheat under the snow in the south field, and she thought about what had just happened and what it meant. It meant that Agnes Kemper in Missouri had the right to buy back her land if she wanted it. It meant that 25 other families had the same right. It meant that whatever Sutter's next move was, it would happen under federal scrutiny and with a public record that made the 43 acquisitions visible in a way they had never been while he was assembling them quietly along a survey route. It meant she had won, not everything, not perfectly. Winning in a land dispute, she had learned, looked nothing like winning in a story. It looked like paperwork and cold rooms and 11 weeks of administrative proceedings. It felt less like triumph and more like the moment a fever breaks. The crisis is over, but you're still in bed, still tired, still aware of everything the illness cost you. But she had won. She put on her coat and went out to the barn and stood with the heifers for a few minutes, the way she sometimes stood with animals when she needed something uncomplicated. They were indifferent to land commissioners and railroad surveys, which she found genuinely comforting. She was still in the barn when she heard a horse, and she knew before she looked that it would be Gideon. He came in through the barn door and stopped when he saw her face. "The ruling," he said. "It came this morning." "And?" "We won," she said. It was the first time she'd used that word, and it felt strange in her mouth, too simple for what had actually happened, too clean for how the last 4 months had felt. He exhaled, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He sat down on the nearest feed sack and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and she understood that he had been carrying this too, in his particular way, quietly, without making it her burden to manage on top of her own. "Good," he said. "That's good." They sat in the barn for a while with the heifers and the hay smell and the cold coming through the boards, and neither of them said much because sometimes the end of a long fight doesn't call for words so much as for sitting in the same space and letting the tension out slowly. After a while, he said, "You told me to ask you when it was finished." "I did," she said. "It's finished." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the steady gray eyes that had been, she realized, a constant in the landscape of the last 4 months. At the fence line, at the county office, at the work table, on her porch step, at her kitchen table going over calculations. Present, without taking over. Useful, without making her feel managed. She had loved Daniel. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. Not in the way of diminishing it or explaining it away, but in the way of acknowledging that it was real and it had mattered and it was also done. And that being done didn't mean she was done. "I have conditions," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Tell me." "This property stays mine, legally in my name, regardless of what happens between us. I will not merge it into a larger operation and disappear inside someone else's enterprise." "Yes," he said. "I run my land the way I run it. My calculations, my decisions, my methods. You can have opinions. I'll consider them." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. "And I won't be decoration," she said. "I won't be the rancher's wife who used to be interesting before she got married. Whatever I am now is what I stay." He looked at her for a long moment in the cold barn, and there was something in his expression that she thought, for the first time in a long time, she could read without ambiguity. "Those aren't conditions I need to tolerate," he said. "They're the reasons I'm asking." She looked at him, then she said, "All right." Not dramatically, not with a great flowering of emotion, just all right in the plain, declarative way she said things that she meant completely. They married in April, when the ground was soft enough to work again. It was a small thing. A few people, a brief ceremony, no speeches. Mrs. Fenn brought food. Silas stood with Gideon in the same watchful, quiet way he stood for everything. Adler rode in from Hayes, which surprised her, and shook her hand first before he shook Gideon's, which she noted. The railroad easement agreement was signed the following week. The terms were fair. She'd had Adler review them 3 times, and Gideon's railroad contacts had given her a realistic picture of what fair looked like in these negotiations. And the access fee was enough to clear the full balance of what she owed on the lease amendment, with money remaining that went directly into the account she maintained in her own name, which had never been closed even in the worst years. She paid the account back to zero the morning the easement payment arrived. She sat at the table and wrote the final settlement figures in the ledger and drew a line under the Sutter expenses column and added up the total of what the fight had cost. Then she turned to a fresh page and started a new column. The winter wheat had come in thin but genuine. Not a full yield, but proof that the South Field could do what she'd believed it could do. She expanded the planting for the following season, adding a section she'd left fallow for 2 years to let the soil recover. The heifers were settled and healthy, and she began thinking seriously about a small, careful expansion of the herd, not the way she and Daniel had done it, by buying as many animals as they could afford and hoping the land would carry them, but by understanding exactly what the land could support and working within that. It was slower. It was a great deal more work in the calculation phase, and it was, she believed, considerably more likely to survive a bad year than the old approach had been. Gideon's operation and hers were connected by the creek crossing agreement, which was renewed in the fall, renegotiated at her insistence, with terms that reflected the new value of the crossing, now that the railroad easement was public. He accepted the new terms without argument, and she suspected he'd expected her to renegotiate and had been curious to see when and how she'd do it. She did it in September at his work table with both ledgers open. "You held back on the access fee," she said, pointing to his projection. "I thought it was a reasonable opening position," he said. "It was a reasonable opening position," she said. "This is my counteroffer." He looked at her counteroffer and then at her, and he said, "Silas told me you'd have one." "Silas is observant," she said. "He says the same about you." They settled on a number that was between her counteroffer and his opening, which was where both of them had expected to land, and they wrote it into the new agreement and both signed it, and she kept her copy in the ledger and he kept his in his file, and they shook hands across the table the way they'd shaken hands the very first time, back in October of the previous year when everything was still uncertain and she'd been sleeping beside a cold fireplace with her boots on. 2 years after the land commissioner's ruling, Pete Callahan's brother recovered his Section 31 property at the original sale price plus interest, exercising the right of repurchase the ruling had established. Agnes Kemper did not come back from Missouri. She'd built a different life there, and the land held complicated associations she wasn't ready to return to. But she used the difference between what Sutter had paid her and what he'd been ordered to refund to buy a smaller piece of ground near her sister's farm, and she wrote Elowen a letter about it. The letter came on a Thursday in early spring while Elowen was doing fence checks on the North Line. Gideon brought it out to her when it arrived, which told her he'd noticed it was from Missouri and understood it was something she'd want to see. She read it leaning against the fence post in the morning sun, with the mud from the thaw on her boots and the new spring grass coming up green around her feet. Agnes Kemper wrote with the directness of a woman who had been through something that had taken longer to recover from than the acute crisis suggested. She wrote about the journal she'd kept and what it had felt like to have those entries matter, to have her own written record become part of something larger than the document she'd made it in her own kitchen because she was a woman who wrote things down and had nowhere else to put what was happening to her. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I never met you. I don't know exactly what you did or how you did it, but I know that whatever you started didn't stop with your property, and I wanted you to know that from where I'm standing, it reached all the way to Missouri." Elowen read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood in the spring morning looking at her fence line. Straight, well set, the posts at the right depth, the wire run correctly. Gideon was watching her from the other side of the line. "Good news?" he said. "Yes," she said. He waited because he had learned over the course of 2 years of marriage to this woman that she would tell him what she wanted him to know and that pressing for more was a poor use of both their time. "A woman in Missouri got her land back," she said. He nodded slowly. She put the letter back in her pocket and picked up her fence-checking notes and kept walking the line. The old house behind her still stood, which she'd made clear from the beginning was not negotiable. She'd had 2 chances in the years since the marriage to rebuild it substantially, and she'd declined both times. Not out of sentiment, though there was sentiment in it, but because the old house with its imperfect walls and its repaired table and its mismatched kitchen was where she had learned what she was capable of when there was nothing easy left to rely on. That education lived in those walls, and she wasn't interested in tearing it down to build something that looked more like success. She had added a room, though, a proper workspace with shelving for the ledgers. She had 7 of them now, full. and a proper desk and a lamp that didn't require the fire to be going. She did her calculations there in the evenings, and sometimes Gideon sat across from her doing his own work, and sometimes they talked about the land and what they were planning and what they'd learned that year, and sometimes they didn't talk at all, just worked in the same quiet space the way two people work when they've figured out how to share a life without losing themselves in it. The winter wheat had become the thing she was known for, among the neighboring homesteaders who had started asking her about the Southfield rotation she'd developed. She showed them the calculations when they asked, because she understood that knowledge hoarded was knowledge that died with one person, and there was no particular credit in being the only one who knew something that could help everyone. She showed them the ledger methods too, not just what she knew about soil and drainage and crop rotation, but how she'd recorded it, how the discipline of writing things down in real time had given her something to stand on when she had very little else. Several women asked her about that specifically, the documentation, the methods. And she talked them through it the same way she'd talk through a fence repair, practically, without mystifying it, with the understanding that the tools were only useful if you actually used them. There were things she couldn't fix and knew it. Agnes Kemper had a different life now because of what had been taken from her, and the fact that she'd found ground near her sister's farm didn't undo what the taking had cost her. 26 families had been given the right of repurchase, but not all of them could exercise it. Some had already resettled, some didn't have the money, some had absorbed the loss into a new direction and couldn't go back. The ruling had been real and the remedy had been genuine, and it still hadn't reached everyone the harm had reached. That was the honest truth of it, and she held it honestly, rather than paper over it with the easier story where justice arrived complete and clean. But she also held the other true thing, which was that one woman who wrote everything down in a brown leather ledger had started something that traveled further than her 320 acres of difficult Kansas soil. She hadn't set out to do that. She'd set out to keep her land, and the keeping of it, the specific, stubborn, documented, unmovable keeping of it, had shown other people what keeping looked like, and that had mattered in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully measure. She thought about that sometimes when she was working the Southfield, or checking the creek bank, or sitting at the new desk in the evening with a fresh ledger open. She thought about what it meant to hold on, not the romantic version, not the story of a woman too proud to quit, too brave to break, too righteous to fail. The real version. A woman who was exhausted, who had sold her mother's candlesticks and slept upright in her coat beside a cold fire, who had been frightened in ways she'd written in the ledger and frightened in ways she hadn't written anywhere, who had made decisions not because she was certain they were right, but because they were the best she could see with what she had. Holding on didn't look heroic from the inside. From the inside, it looked like checking the fence in November when your hands were too cold to feel the wire properly. It looked like riding to town in October to file a report that you knew wasn't going to result in anyone being arrested, because the report wasn't for the arrest, it was for the record. It looked like rewriting a business agreement in your own kitchen because the terms weren't right and trusting your own judgment enough to hand it back. It looked like ordinary days, one after another, each one asking something of you that you gave because giving up was also a choice and you'd made a different one. She had made that choice, and she had kept making it, and the accumulation of it was the life she was living now. On a Tuesday morning in May, 2.5 years after Gideon Rourke had first ridden up her South Road and found her fence collapsing and her garden planted and her yard swept clean, Elowen Hartley Rourke walked her full property line in the early light, the way she did at the start of every season. She carried the ledger. The fence was standing where it should stand. The creek bank showed the measured wear of cattle crossings properly documented and within the agreed parameters. The south field was planted and the winter wheat from last season had come in stronger than the year before. The barn roof was sound. The old house stood. She walked the line and wrote what she saw, and when she completed the circuit and came back to the gate she'd built herself from mismatched lumber and slightly imperfect hinges, she stopped and looked at the property in the full spring morning. 320 acres of difficult soil, the kind of place that broke people who didn't understand it or who needed it to be easier than it was. She understood it. She didn't need it to be easier. She needed it to be hers, and it was, cleanly and completely, with her name on the deed and the deed filed and clear and no notation in any county record that a careful man with a lawyer could use to shake it loose. She unlatched the gate and went through and latched it behind her. She went inside. She put the ledger on the desk in the new workspace, opened it to the morning's entry, and finished writing the last line. Then she closed it and went to make coffee, and the spring day came in through the kitchen window, and somewhere in the south field, the new wheat was doing what wheat does when the soil has been properly understood and the work has been honestly done. It was growing. She stood at the kitchen window while the coffee heated and looked out at the south field, at the green coming up in the rows. She'd turned herself, and she thought about something Adler had said to her once, near the end of the proceedings, when the paperwork was nearly done, and they were sitting in his Hayes office going over the final settlement figures. He'd said, "Most people in your situation would have signed the paper." She'd asked him why he thought she hadn't. He'd thought about it for a moment, genuinely, not in the way lawyers perform consideration, but in the way a person does when a question catches them somewhere real. "Because you kept the ledger," he said finally. "People who write things down believe their version of events is worth preserving, and people who believe that tend to fight for it." She hadn't had an answer for that then. She wasn't sure she had one now. She hadn't kept the ledger because she was brave or because she'd anticipated needing it in a territorial land dispute. She'd kept it because Daniel was gone and the ranch was hers alone, and she had no one to remember things with her, and forgetting felt like another kind of loss she couldn't afford. But Adler wasn't entirely wrong either. There was something in the act of writing things down, in the daily, undramatic discipline of recording what happened and what it cost and what it meant. That was also a kind of declaration. A refusal to let the official version be the only version. A way of saying, I was here, and this is what I saw, and it matters that someone wrote it down. She had been here. She poured the coffee and carried it to the desk and sat down and opened the ledger to a fresh page, the way she did every morning. Not because there was a crisis requiring documentation, but because the habit was the practice, and the practice was what had held her together when nothing else could. At the top of the page, she wrote the date, the way she always did. Below it, she wrote, Southfield showing strong growth, second season. Creek bank within documented parameters. Fence line intact. Heifers in good condition. She paused. Then she added, in the plain, declarative way she wrote everything she meant completely. This land is ours. We know what it cost. We will not forget. She closed the ledger. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings do on the Kansas frontier. Arriving without ceremony, without apology, indifferent to everything that had happened on this ground, and asking only that you show up and work it. She finished her coffee, put on her boots, and went out to meet it.